Hey guys, this is Lawrence of the Ketones and Coffee Podcast. Make sure to subscribe down below so you don't miss out on any of this great content. So excited for this, guys. Stick around. We got Zach Bitter on the show. Zach is a professional endurance athlete and an endurance coach. He has multiple world and American record performances, and he also coaches endurance athletes from Olympic distance to ultramarathon. With his mission is to help achieve their endurance goals from beginners to advance. Zach is also the host of the ultra popular podcast, the Human Performance Outlier podcast. Zach, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks a bunch for having me on.
Awesome, man. So you've done incredible feats, my friend. Not to blow up smoke, but we have a chance to let my listeners know the possibilities of breaking our perceived limitations here. And when you have a limitless mindset paired with a limitless fuel source, I think we got something special here. Zach, are you from this world, first of all? Because, or are you on another planet breaking records?
No, I assure you I'm from this world, and there's plenty of people out there who can run faster than me, but it's a sport that I've been in love with now for quite some time. I did my first endurance race in middle school, so I got my first kind of taste of that kind of pretty early in life, and but yeah, it's been a journey. I would have never guessed it would have ended, or I shouldn't say ended. I'm still hopefully still going strong, but yeah, it's been an exciting life experience for sure.
Awesome, man. For our listeners here right now, if you don't know Zach already, here are his notable accomplishments here. Zach has broken both world and American records, and he also won 4 national championships and has 60 ultramarathons under his belt, and he currently holds the American records for the fastest 100-mile and the longest distance in 12 hours. Is that right?
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And all of that accomplishments on a ketogenic diet. Is this the works of the ketogenic diet? I'd like to think so. Before I get to your story, Zach, on how it all started for you, I'm always fascinated with marathon, ultramarathon runners because of how they were able to push the body's physical limits. And on a deeper level, I believe we all started somewhere. And you talked about starting at a very young age earlier. And what inspired you to start running in the beginning, Zach?
Yeah, I actually didn't really recognize running as kind of a sport until the Presidential Physical Fitness Challenge, the stuff our Phi Ed class did, and I think it was 6th grade. I always just kind of saw running as more or less a vehicle for other sports that me and my friends would like to do during recess or after school during sports programs and things like that. So my first taste was with that, and it also was kind of convenient in the way they structure those things. I don't know. I've probably said this a few times on other podcasts, but I'm not 100% sure if they still do Presidential Physical Fitness challenges in schools or not anymore. But you do essentially a battery of different tests that kind of highlight your strengths and weaknesses across the fitness spectrum. And that was kind of my first opportunity to see if you can be quite good at a certain sport or certain discipline and quite bad at another one. It was before that in my mind it was kind of you're either athletic or you're not, and that's where I kind of recognized that maybe distance running was something that I was a little bit better at than say sprinting or some other sports that you're going to do different types of strength or speed and power types things. So yeah, I mean, I didn't take it super seriously though. I just kind of kept doing what I had been doing and included running within the variety of different sports I did up until end of high school. I started kind of focusing a bit more specifically on running, and then in college I was sort of all in at that and kind of eliminated or cut out most of the other stuff that wasn't kind of running related in terms of my physical preparation type mindset.
Mm-hmm. So it just naturally evolved from there, from just from 6th grade, getting a taste of it. It just evolved from there and just wanting to. What was the goal? Is the goal change? Does the goal change at every level?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I feel like one of the reasons why I still really, really enjoy running the way I do is because I didn't get almost overwhelmed by it at such an early age. I kind of learned a little bit very, very slowly, and that kind of put me in a position to sort of gradually ease into the sport versus kind of get too involved with it at such an early age where I lose interest or got expectations above and beyond what I was going to be able to do or be capable of doing. And with that, there's a lot of just mostly ignorance, I guess, in terms of what I was doing. But eventually I got to a point where I wanted to understand the sport more in detail, and that was basically in college. So yeah, it was a real gradual progression. I think I was probably running seasonally like maybe 20 up to 30 miles per week when I was in high school. And then by my senior year, I think I ran year round, but at a very low volume. College is when I kind of really started to understand that like there was a whole nother like side to the world of running where like building up like higher volume is got some application depending on the distance and the specifics of what you're training for. And I sort of kind of liked that approach. So by the time I left college, I had started to kind of build up a kind of a foundation where I was running 100 miles a week consistently. And that sort of led to ultramarathons.
And then just meeting people along the way, I guess.
Yeah, it's always been interesting. You know, I've always had teams along the way, kind of in my early days between high school and college, which was really, really good for me because it allowed me to kind of see like both what other people were doing as well as where their background and their perspectives were. And especially in college when I, you know, got to know my teammates who definitely knew much more about running and were definitely more involved in it when they were in high school for the most part. So it was cool to be able to lean on some of their expertise and watch them kind of move through the sport as well. And then take that information to, you know, post-college where I did a lot of my training and stuff by myself, which I still mostly do. But it was kind of it gave me the opportunity to kind of like see the value in training with groups, teams, as well as, you know, having your own control over your training and training by yourself. There's some value in that as well. And then, just kind of learning the ins and outs of how to prepare for all the different distances that I've done since then.
I want to always point out about runners is there really an age that's too late to start running, Zach?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, it's like any sport. There's probably an age where you can assume that there'll be kind of a gradual decline in where your optimal performance is going to get to. But in terms of like enjoying the sport of running, I always see these clips from time to time. Every year they'll do like the USATF or the World Championships for like the age groups and stuff like that, and they'll be like some 100-year-old doing a race, and it's just like, you can keep doing it, I guess. So I think as long as you recognize like the limitations that kind of come along with aging and things like that, then you can still enjoy the sport.
We'll get to your story here, Zach, in a bit. Not only that you've broken world records, but you have broken the standards of performance. You know, what type of feedback have you gotten from the ultramarathon community when you switched to keto, breaking records like that? Yeah,
there was a couple other people that were kind of playing around with that approach when I first got into it that I kind of saw as like, okay, well, there's some application here. It wasn't just the kind of like me all on myself on an island, and some of them were quite good too. Like I think Tim Olson, who when I first got into ultramarathon running, was on a tear, and he won the Western States Endurance Run 2 years in a row and broke the course record at the time at one point. And I don't know that he still does lower carbohydrate, but he was kind of in that sort of approach, at least in the early stages of his career. So it was kind of interesting to watch him make it work. And then there was another guy who is probably one of the more inspiring ultra runners that I followed still to date, Mike Morton, who he broke the Western States course record back in 1997, and he had some hip issues, I think, and also like his career made it very difficult for him to train and race competitively. So he sort of stepped away from the sport for nearly 10 years, and then came back and just went on this tear running. And he was from Florida, so he's doing a lot of flat ultra marathons because that's what he had available to train. And then in 2013, I'm pretty certain, he found himself at the Western States 100 as, I think, a 41-year-old and just moved up the field all day and got all the way up to third place and kind of put the heat on Tim Olson and Rob Krar, who are kind of two of the top guys to ever run that race at the very end as a 41-year-old. And so he broke the Masters record there. And he was like doing some lower carb stuff when he did that. So I had some kind of good examples of like, all right, this is something that can work. And then it was just kind of a question of whether will it work for me and that sort of thing. So, so I kind of got into it late 2011 and probably spent the better part of a year and a half, 2 years, just kind of fine tuning my approach. It gets a little more complicated, I think, than when you think of just like a strict ketogenic diet where, most people who are going to well, and most people who are going to follow any diet are probably going to have a relatively consistent lifestyle where there's not like these huge ebbs and flows between their energy output from day to day.
Yeah.
Endurance athletes are a little different like that, where, if someone like myself, if I take a rest day, my energy output might be half or even less than half of what it'll be when I'm in like full training and doing, bigger training sessions that are sometimes like 20, 30 miles in length and things like that. So there just ends up being like this kind of like really absurdly large energy intake for a relatively small person. And with that comes just kind of like some variance in kind of like what I'm going to eat from one day to the next versus what I would do if I had a very consistent energy output from one day to the next and was living like, I don't want to say a sedentary lifestyle, but a lifestyle that didn't have me, training the way I do for ultramarathon events and things like that. So I kind of break it down into different phases of training where I have like off season where I'm going to be the lowest carbohydrate that I'll have throughout the year, which is typically looks pretty close to like a strict ketogenic diet. And then I'll do like kind of what I call like a base building phase where I'm working on just really fine tuning the lower intensity stuff, building that foundation that I'm going to build off, and just kind of confirm that my fitness is there before I start specifying towards whatever race I'm going to do. And that's still pretty low intensity stuff. The volume starts to pick up, so my energy expenditure does go up. So with that, all my intake increases. So I'll bring my carbohydrates up a little bit past what people would probably consider a strict ketogenic diet during that phase, at least from a gram standpoint, perhaps not from a percentage standpoint. But then I start training kind of least specific, but things that I find important. And then I get more specific as I get closer to a race. So since I'm training for 100 milers that tend to be quite slow relative to most endurance events, that just means I'm doing like higher intensity stuff early in the plan and then moderate intensity stuff kind of near the middle of the plan, and then really fine tuning the long run and the slower type of running that I'll be doing for race day near the end of the plan when I'm closer to the race itself. So I'll have different kind of ways that I'll be kind of utilizing carbohydrate throughout those different ones. It's always takes a backseat to the fat in terms of how much of it I'm eating. But like when I'm doing the short interval phase of training, there's a couple days of the week where my carbohydrates will be, a fair bit higher than they would be on like most other days during the year, certainly off-season type stuff. And then when I'm kind of back towards long-run development and really trying to drive my fat oxidation rates up for race day, and I'm removing a lot of the intensity, I start kind of pushing those carbohydrates way back down, kind of closer to what they were during the base building phase of training, and really kind of prepare myself for what I'm going to try to be doing on race day.
So you had to look this up before, because you can't be, you're an athlete and your energy levels and you're in tune with your body. I am assuming, and the lifestyle change decision. There are so many diets that claims they're better than others, right? But when did you realize that this is what you're going to do? Because it cannot be until you actually experience this. You cannot take anyone's experience before yourself. And do you remember your first official race on keto?
Yeah, so I would have switched over at the end of 2011 during off season, which gave me quite a big ramp up to kind of play around with some things. And I went strict ketogenic during that off season for about 4 weeks, and then started my build up towards what I was going to be training for 2012. And once I kind of got into that training and started adding some of the speed work back, I just started playing around kind of with some strategic carbohydrate usage around some of the higher intensity stuff, but still like very much within the low carb framework. And then my first, I think, goal race would have been the Ice Age 50 mile.
Hey Ketones crew, if you want to work with me, I just released my one-on-one 60-minute consultation where we will take a deeper dive into your health journey and formulate a plan where you can incorporate the ketogenic diet to fit your lifestyle. If you're interested, take control of your health today. Click the link on the description box below and let's get started. Hey guys, let me tell you about this delivery service that's been a total game changer for my lifestyle. Did you know that it's now possible to get local, fresh groceries delivered right at your doorstep? Well, Instacart gives you unlimited grocery delivery for one low monthly fee. And if I can avoid buying non-keto friendly items from supermarkets who psychs you into buying unhealthy foods, plus if it saves me a lot of time and money, sign me up. Instacart is hand selected by shoppers based on your preferences, so no more rock hard avocados, and they will keep your eggs safe too. And Instacart will find everything you usually buy and get smart suggestions for new items. And you can get your first order today delivered for free when you purchase over $35 by following the link on the show notes below to let Instacart know that I sent you and to help to support the show. Instacart, never step foot in the grocery store again.
Which was a race that was in kind of southeastern Wisconsin, and at the time was what they call a golden ticket race, where the top two finishers will get an entry to the Western States 100. And I ended up going there with the intent of just training and racing that particular race. I had really no interest in doing a 100-miler yet at that time, but I ended up winning it, getting offered the golden ticket, and then everyone who I talked to after that who knew much more about the sport than I did told me I'd be an idiot if I didn't take that spot. So so I took it and ended up doing my first 100-miler later that summer. But yeah, that was kind of the first race where I really had a chance to kind of like test out all the things that I had been practicing and learning. And one of the things that stuck out to me the most was earlier, I had done 350-milers at the end of 2011 before I had switched. So I had been following a moderate to high carbohydrate diet to that point. And the thing that stuck out to me the most with Ice Age 50-mile versus those other 350-milers that I had done the prior year was that my fueling intake changed fairly drastically. I was able to kind of eat about half of what I was eating during those other 50-mile races, and my energy felt more consistent, less kind of roller coastery, and also not dampened to the point where I felt like I had smooth energy, but not enough to kind of maximize my potential. So for me, that was a big win, because one thing I was noticing in those 50-milers I'd done the year prior was that I could get through them kind of fueling the way I felt I needed to on a moderate to high carbohydrate diet. But by the end, I was definitely feeling like, the digestion start to kind of get a little more on thin ice, so to speak, and realized like if I wanted to do a 100-miler someday, I'd probably have to figure out something different, because doing 50 more miles feeling the way I was for those 50-milers just likely wasn't going to work out. So finishing Ice Age on essentially half of what I took in during those other ones was a good sign for me, because that sort of meant, okay, now I can likely extrapolate this out further to like 100 miles without having to worry too much about digestive issues causing me any trouble during those races.
And you attribute this to winning that race. Do you attribute that to that change in lifestyle?
I don't know. It's hard to say with these things. There's just so many variables to consider, and it's like the example I like to use is like if I have just a great buildup for a race, like the best buildup I've ever had, and then go and nail that race. It's really easy to think like, okay, what I did in that training block was the secret move to like getting everything I can out of that race. But in reality, every time that I go through another training cycle, I'm somewhat leaning on the fitness that I've acquired over the years or decades of running. So it's hard to tease out exactly how much each of these variables play. So I would say like the big movers for performance are going to be proper stress and recovery balance. So doing the right amount of training that you can recover from. Sleep, which just kind of fits into that recovery side of things, and then nutrition. So nutrition is going to be a big variable in terms of getting you to the finish line quicker. For me, I think like that's played a big part in how I've been able to race over the years. So it's certainly a piece to that puzzle, but I don't know that I would say it's the entirety.
Okay, so would you say the change in diet helped your sleep?
For me, it did, and that was actually one of the reasons why I kind of stuck with it at first. When I switched over, like I kind of mentioned earlier, I was fortunate enough that I had been able to engage with Dr. Stephen Finney and Dr. Jeff Volek a bit and get enough information from them so I didn't just screw everything up right out the gate. And I had some protocols in place that I kind of knew would likely be the right path forward to discover if this was going to work for me. And one thing I noticed was within about a week, I was sleeping through the night, which was kind of an interesting thing for me personally, because historically in my life, I'd always been a really good sleeper. Even through college, I could easily pretty much go to bed, wake up 8-9 hours later, feeling rested. Somewhere between then and before I switched to a lower carbohydrate diet, I would have like real terrible sleep where I would be like blocking off, say like 10 hours a night just to try to get 8 hours of sleep because I knew I was going to wake up multiple times. So when I switched, that cleared up right away. That, and I ended up feeling like I had just more steady energy throughout the course of the day. Didn't really have a long transition for that or anything. It was like within a week or two, I started noticing those things improve. And then it was just about figuring out how to make that work with the training side of things. Because when I did start running after that, I noticed there was a little bit of volatility in terms of even my easy pace. I'd go out and like one day I'd be running pretty much the same pace at an intensity that I expected. Another day I'd go out and I'd put it that same intensity and be like a minute or two per mile slower. And I thought that was kind of odd. That more or less cleared up over about 4 weeks or so, and then it was just kind of figuring out now how do I make this work when I introduce things like speed work or increased volume and all the other things that kind of come into a periodized approach to training.
Coming into that race, the 50-miler race, do you remember doing anything else different than just changing your diet?
The biggest thing I did differently for that race probably than what I did with other ultramarathons was the particular race I was doing is like what they call kind of like a sawtooth design where there aren't like any really big long climbs or descents, but there's a bunch of really small choppy ones. So I lived in a really flat area, but there was a sledding hill kind of near where I lived. So I'd run there in the mornings and I would just do repeats on that hill up and down just to kind of mimic the course profile. So there was definitely some course specificity that I was getting for that race that I likely hadn't in some previous ones to a large degree. But other than that, it was pretty standard for what I had been doing the prior year from a training standpoint. Volume was pretty consistent. I've changed kind of the way I prepare for ultramarathons a bit since then. But at the time, I was doing pretty much the same kind of approach as I had in the prior ones that I had done.
So after that 50-miler race that you won, and you said that was your first 100-miler after that?
Yeah, so after that one, I qualified for the Western States 100 and ended up doing that as my first 100-mile race.
And prior to that, you said you didn't imagine yourself running 100 miles after.
Yeah, I knew I would, but I had no interest in doing it at that point in time. Yeah, I thought like when I crossed the finish line, I think I even told what happens is like they offer the 2 spots to the top 2 runners, and then if one of them defers, it gets passed down to third. So I was talking to the third place finisher. I think I even told them like chances are.
So you're actually wanting to opt out of that?
Yeah, and it was just one of those things where I just didn't know like how big of a deal the Western States 100 was yet. So. When people just told me, like, look, that's, to give you some perspective, like, if you try to get into that race without racing in, there's, like, you went to this lottery process, and every year they give you more tickets, so your likelihood of getting in increases every year you apply. But on average, it takes people, like, about 4 to 5 years to get in, and your first year you apply, you got, like, I think it's less than 2% chance of getting in. So it's a very difficult race. So, like, if you talk to someone who knows anything about ultramarathon running, and you say you have a spot at Western States, and you're not going to take it, they're going to look at you like you've got 3 eyes. So,
so what would the second place do for that ticket? Like, let's say you did opt out of that. What would that person who would get that entry feel about or think about you?
They would be stoked. Yeah, in most cases, yeah. I mean, it just depends. There's always going to be people who just don't want to, or for whatever reason, they've got different priorities and things like that. But, or, you also get guys who just know they're going to be able to race in again. So, when I was first got into ultra running, one of the guys who was just doing really, really well at like 50-mile races, 100-kilometer races, and that sort of distance was a guy named Max King, and he would qualify for golden tickets all the time and pass up on them. I think he took 2 over the course of his career so far, but he passed on more than he took. So, I mean, there's that side of it too. And not everyone really wants to, like, the 100-mile gets a lot of love, especially in North America, but there are people who just prefer to race, distances between like 50K and 100K and are really, really good at it. So you talk to them and they're like, they don't even know that they really want to do a 100-miler, and they may not be as good at the 100-miler as they are at like the 50K to the 100K. Yep. And there's a big trade-off or opportunity cost there too, where some people you train and race a 100-miler, you could probably do 2 or 3 other races in place of that if you wanted to. So it's like, if you really enjoy the other stuff, do you really want to, sacrifice a couple or 3 other events potentially just to do this 100-miler that you're not even sure you want to do?
What did you feel at that time? Did you feel intimidated or excited? What?
I was definitely excited. I was too naive to be overly intimidated, although I probably should have been, given what I know now about the sport. But Yeah, for me, it was just kind of like, it was weird. It was like, I think I went into it without thinking there was really any possibility that I wouldn't finish and that there was a good possibility that I would do well. So I was going in there with confidence for sure. And, also curiosity, because the Western States 100 is out on a trail that goes up through the high country, up to like 9,200 feet, I think is where it peaks out on. And then it drops down and goes through this like series of canyons that'll sometimes get up into the 100-degree range. And then you get to 100 kilometers on that race, and then you're running on a pretty runnable trail, mostly downhill from there to the finish line. So it just has a variety of different like kind of trail and mountain type features to it, which was completely foreign to what I had done in the past. So I think like my biggest learning, actually one of the bigger learning experiences I had was I got out there. So I was teaching at the time, and I basically, as soon as we finished the last day of school, I think within the next week, I was on a plane out there to California where that race was, and I did like a big training block, like I shouldn't say block, but like a long run, like it was essentially back to back long runs about, I think it was like maybe just over a week before, which is probably a little close in hindsight, but I needed to see the course to some degree because I had just zero experience on that train. I ended up running about 70 miles of that course in about 3 days. And at that point, I was like, okay, this is definitely different from stuff I've done in the past. And now I can appreciate kind of the times people are running there or the paces they're averaging. Because, for someone who's coming from like a collegiate track and cross-country background and had run some road races and a few ultramarathons that were relatively flat, you look at the paces that people average for some of these mountain courses and you just wonder, like, it looks slow on paper. But then when you get out there and actually do it, you realize, oh, okay, yeah, you go up a 20% incline, you're going to be moving quite a bit slower. So you kind of get a little bit of a learning experience from that sort of thing, just kind of figuring out how to like address that sort of stuff and pace yourself properly through those, and manage everything there. So it's it highlights kind of the variety you have in the sport for sure.
You did say you had to change some things. Does that mean from the 50-mile race, what nutrition-wise, what did you have to change?
I didn't change too much nutritionally between the 50-miler and the 100-miler. I was probably eating a little less carbohydrate on race day for the 100-mile since the intensity was lower. You just don't need quite as much carbohydrate per hour as you lower the intensity. So I was able to have probably a little more solid foods too. So I wasn't necessarily trying to go with like all sports products like I did at the Ice Age 50. At these 50-milers, you can get them done quick enough where you can sort of lean on maybe 1 or 2 fuel sources pretty easily without too much issue. You get to these races that are going to be like 15, 16, 17, 18 hours in duration. You almost get like this thing that's like describes like palate fatigue, where if you're just having the same thing over and over again, it can be your favorite thing to eat. You're eventually going to get sick of it and unmotivated to eat it. So when I start getting to these longer races, I get a little more particular about making sure I have like contrasting flavor profiles and textures of different things that I'm eating and drinking, so that I'm not necessarily getting that same type of experience every time I'm bringing in fuel. So that usually means something that's more liquidy and a little more sweet flavored for like one of my fuel sources, and something that's maybe a little more crunchy, a little more savory, a little more salty for like the solid food option. And then if I go kind of back and forth between those things, I tend to feel like I'm motivated to eat the amount of calories that I'm looking to get in during a race like a 100-miler.
So this is you're getting this all through from experience, just knowing your body from different races. Is that right? Like just To a large degree. I mean, there's also, like, as I got further into it, I started putting more actual data to it. So, for example, in 2014, I got my first fat oxidation test where I could actually see, like, where my metabolism, how my metabolism is behaving at different intensities. And with that information, you can, kind of see, like, well, if I'm going to run a 100-miler at this intensity, then I should plan on eating this much carbohydrate based on the percentages of fat to carbohydrate I was taking in. So the most detailed I did with that was in 2019 when I ran my fastest 100-miler to date. I had gotten a fat oxidation test that suggested that at my 100-mile pace, I was going to be burning somewhere in the neighborhood of like 80 to 90% fat. So then that meant that from my carbohydrate side,
of metabolism is going to be somewhere between 10 to 20%. So given that the pace I was targeting there came out to be roughly 9 miles per hour, I knew I was going to be burning somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 to 1,000 calories per hour, which just meant if I was going to defend muscle glycogen, which is the fuel tank that's going to potentially deplete over the course of a long race, or any race for that matter, I knew like somewhere around like probably 30 to 40 grams of carbohydrate would be enough to defend muscle glycogen. So I just sort of dripped that in through the course of that day at that frequency. And it was interesting. I actually ran my fastest miles at the end of that race. So I was clearly not depleted in terms of having my muscle glycogen dip low enough where I started feeling like I had to work much harder to produce the same pace. In fact, I was moving quicker. So that would imply that it was likely well intact. So it'd be tough to get away with those levels of carbohydrate per hour if I was on a moderate to high carbohydrate diet. The recommendations for someone following a moderate carbohydrate diet for a single day ultramarathon is going to be like 50 to 70 grams. So, I'm under the low end of that and still defending muscle glycogen in a way where I'm able to run fast at the end of a race, which is just good indication that I'm kind of like at least heading in the right direction for myself at the end of one side of things.
In the coaching aspect of things, what are the markers that you look at when you're teaching somebody, how to fuel your body properly? What do you look at their metabolic health, or how they're is it there can't be a one size fits all with this approach?
No, definitely not. I mean, I've worked with like tons of people that are interested in doing a low carbohydrate approach. Some of them come in with some experience where they've been doing even like, I've got some people, they'll come in and like, I've been eating 30 grams of carbohydrate or less pretty consistently for the last 2 years. And then I'll have other people who come in and they're like, I've been eating a moderate to high carbohydrate diet my whole life, but I'm just struggling with the fueling side of things during races. I can't seem to be able to eat enough in order to, feel like my energy levels are sustained, and I'm curious about trying this in order to kind of lower my intra-race fueling needs, and everything in between. So, yeah, and I get a variety of experience too. I'll have some folks where they really love the lifestyle of keeping their carbohydrates quite low, like lower than I would typically keep them, or lower than I wowould typically see someone training, say, 10 plus hours per week when they're peaking for a race. And I assume like, okay, well, you can stay that low, but you might struggle on some of these workouts, and then some of them just do just fine, and others will start out, and by the time we get to the end of it, we've walked them almost all the way back to a moderate carbohydrate diet, and it was just kind of for them that happened to be what worked for them. So I don't know that there's necessarily like a silver bullet diet for anybody within ultramarathon running. I think it's sort of this weird thing where the intensity is so low on race day and the duration is so long. The window is much more open than, say, it would be for like elite marathon running, where you have these guys who are running like almost up to their lactate threshold for a little over 2 hours. And that's just such a unique experience, or it's such a unique physiological state for anyone to be in, that like the demand for energy is at such a rate that you just got to speed it up. So for someone like the world record marathoner to go on a strict ketogenic diet would likely come at the expense of his finishing time, whereas you have somebody who is running a marathon kind of near the middle of the pack, and they've got all these other life variables that are improving with their kind of lower carbohydrate ketogenic diet. Those variables, if cleaned up, may supersede any performance deficit they're going to have at a higher or like a moderate intensity race that would typically be targeted with a little bit more of a moderate to high carbohydrate approach. So you get a lot of individual things that are going to be unique to the individual that are worth considering. And I always like kind of playing around with those with people and figuring out kind of, first of all, where their goals and interests are. I think a lot of times we sort of immediately go to performance as everyone's kind of ideal situation, where, the more people I coach, the more I realize like, yeah, people want to perform well, but at the end of the day, they don't want peak performance to come at the cost of the rest of their life or, what's working for them nutritionally. So I see more and more people who are like, maybe if I do this a little differently, I could get a fair bit faster, but, getting to the finish line a few minutes earlier than I would have otherwise at the cost of me drastically altering my diet or, doing this, that, or the other thing that on paper looks like it would improve their finishing time isn't worth it for them. So there's a lot of things to consider at the end of the day, which is kind of makes it fun to coach people, though.
You mentioned, somebody that struggles with energy coming from a moderate to high carb diet, approaching you about this, how to fuel yourself, is there a way to ease themselves in this if they have a race coming up in maybe a couple of months? Would you recommend them changing their lifestyle then, or should they wait until off season, or how should they start this?
Yeah, ideally you start in the off season, because I think that allows you to actually even, and not everyone's going to do this, but I think there is some value if someone's interested in a low carbohydrate diet to try like a stricter ketogenic diet for just like, 4 weeks or so, just to kind of see what that feels like and experience what that is. And even if we bring them up, most of my low carbohydrate endurance athletes, once we get into kind of strict, or once we get into structured training, we're getting about a little closer to like say 100 to 150 grams of carbohydrate per day. That's going to likely be on top of 10 plus hours of training per week. So they've increased their energy output by a pretty good margin at that point. And that's going to be like where we try to, what we kind of walk them up to after that. But I still think like in off season, just learning and experiencing kind of a little bit more of a strict ketogenic diet can be useful. Some people are just like, I don't really motivated to do that, but I would like to try low carbohydrate. So the way I explain it to people is, if you think of like your fat oxidation rates, it's on a spectrum. So like if I eliminate carbohydrate altogether, zero carb, as close as possible to that, I'm going to have really high fat oxidation rates, but I'm also going to decrease my body's ability to process and utilize exogenous carbohydrates. So at a certain point, you kind of find like a spot between like high carbohydrate and no carbohydrate that is going to be a spot where they're going to have high enough fat oxidation rates so that they don't have to eat as much as they were if they were having digestive issues from trying to hit that target, but not so low that they like kind of lose their ability to even use a carbohydrate effectively during a training session or during a race. So usually that comes into like kind of a little bit more of a low carb category versus a strict ketogenic category from a gram standpoint. Although I say that, and I have done some tests on myself. Whether this translates perfectly to anyone else is anyone's guess, I guess. But I did a 3-week block of training kind of during my peaking phase for a 100-miler back in 2018, and I was testing blood ketones pretty consistently 2 or 3 times a day. And I had my carbohydrates up to like, on a few days, like even a couple hundred grams when it was like a really big training session. My energy output was a lot. And of all those tests I did, I was above 0.5 millimoles of blood ketone levels on like all but maybe 2 test results for that. And oftentimes I was up closer to 1 and even sometimes above 2 millimoles. So it's like, it's a physiological state more than it is a specific gram number. Mm-hmm. And every person's going to be different as to what a number of grams gets them to that. And then lifestyle plays a big role. Like I couldn't do that. Like if I was just going about my day, maybe running a couple times a week and going to the gym a couple times a week, I couldn't eat a couple 100 grams of carbohydrate in a day and expect to have like any like consistent like ketogenic state, I would imagine. So a lot of it is like considering the lifestyle and recognizing what part of the training you are in during the year and kind of adapting your nutrition to some degree to kind of match what you're doing.
So it usually varies with the pace and the race, the distance, and it's not really whatever your goal is as a runner. What's your goal running a 100-mile? What's somebody's goal should be so that they don't get intimidated
for running a 100-miler? Yeah, I think there's like value to picking multiple goals. So the way I usually tell people is like especially if they're new, it's like let's pick a goal that is like appropriate, but maybe like a bit like if everything goes well today, what would you imagine? What do we imagine you could do? And then if it's their first 100-miler, I want them to keep one goal being finish, because minus something drastic like a bad injury or something that is just gonna like they're gonna get hit by a cutoff anyway because they're not having a great day and they're barely moving, or something that's gonna create a big issue where now they can't run for weeks or months or longer because they acquired something that was a little more drastic because they stuck it out when they shouldn't have. But like within reason, have that one of those goals be just to finish so that you have a reason to be out there if things don't go great. but you can still kind of get the experience of, finishing a 100-miler, so that now when we go back into training, we have a baseline of like, okay, this is what you did. This is where we want to build off of. Here's some of the lessons. You always learn more when things go wrong than when things go great. So like we learn a lot about like what we maybe need to do in terms of getting them better prepared for their next one, so that they can make improvements upon that and things like that. And then usually I'll recommend kind of having a third, like kind of more moderate goal where it's, it's more aggressive than just finishing, but not quite as aggressive as everything goes right. So that you sort of have these tiered options where, maybe that A goal of running the fastest time we expect you to do stays intact for 60 miles, but then you have a bit of a hiccup and that plan kind of falls off. You still have that moderate goal to kind of keep you motivated and keep moving, and not just death march it, is what they'll call it, an ultramarathon to the finish line. But then even if that moderate goal falls off as well, then you still have the incentive to stay out there and finish the race and be able to walk away with that experience and something to build off of.
I want to ask you, as a coach, is there any common changes that runners make from their first to their second? What are the common? Anything?
For 100 miles?
For 100 miles, yeah.
Yeah, usually I think one of the bigger ones is just pacing strategy. So like the hardest thing to really figure out for a 100-mile race is what is the right pace. So you get this weird situation where like even if you're doing like a marathon, a lot of people are going to do a long run that gets them close enough to that distance so that it's not like so far off they couldn't imagine what like, the end result would be. Whereas with a 100-miler, like, we might have you not even running a third of that distance at any one time during the training plan. So there's this big stretch of unknown for like 70-plus miles for a lot of people if they're doing it for the first time and if they haven't done another ultramarathon before. And even if they have, it's like, it's usually been months, if not longer, between then and the time they're running that 100-miler. So when someone runs their first 100-miler, usually we get a pretty clear look at like whether they went out too fast, where the spots for improvement are. A lot of times if I'm looking at someone's kind of race splits for a 100-miler, you can look at like the parts that went well, but really the parts that went well, it's like we're looking at like no to very little opportunity to improve. But you look at the spots that went badly, like this, like they had like an issue and then they sat in an aid station for 20 minutes. Well, if we can fix that problem, we can save you 20 minutes without even having you speed up. Or we look at like there's 5 miles in this race that are your slowest miles, and they were so much slower that each one of them was 10 minutes to the mile slower than all the rest. Well, if there's 5 of those, that's 50 minutes. And if we can just clean up those 5 miles, then you're in a situation where you can run 50 minutes faster just by fixing, 5% of your race. So some of that is usually about kind of more pace management throughout the course as well as kind of early on. I think a lot of ultramarathon runners, myself included, often get out a little too fast, and then you pay for that at the end by giving back more time than you acquired by going out as fast as you did. So a lot of times it's just like, coming up with a reasonable expectation of like, if this is the pace you want to average, is there application for like a walk run strategy? I mean, it's 100 miles after all. And, a lot of people are targeting, like a big goal is to break a 24-hour for 100 miles. So when you think of just the pacing for something like that, there's a lot of opportunity for walking and hiking. And just coming up with a reasonable strategy so that they have enough of that built into the beginning of the race where they are technically physically could be capable of running, but you don't necessarily want to because it's going to put you so far ahead of your goal pace that you're going to just kind of hemorrhage that time at the end. So I think that's probably the one that ends up getting the most. The other one is, when you look at kind of what I said before, if you look at kind of like the recommendations for single-day ultramarathon runners, they're going to recommend a moderate carbohydrate diet and that you take in 50 to 70 grams of carbohydrate per hour, but they're also going to report at like a 6 out of 10 or, above 50% of those people are going to experience some sort of gastrointestinal issue during that race. And of that 60% or 6 out of 10, about half of those are going to have some relatively severe gastrointestinal digestive issue during the race itself. So just by the numbers, chances are you're going to be like 1 out of 3 essentially is going to have some sort of bad experience digestively during that race that if you could fix that, that's another opportunity for some pretty big improvements. So, if you find yourself puking up your nutrition left and right all over the course at the end, chances are you're not moving very fast. So if you can figure out a way to eliminate that, now all of a sudden not only are they moving faster, but they're feeling better doing it. So
Yeah.
I would say
that's a big thing.
yeah. And, it's just one of the realities of these longer races like this where, the variable of consuming food just becomes that much more important versus, even a marathon where you can get away with probably a few hundred calories of fuel intake and still defend muscle glycogen for a distance like that.
You talked about expectation. Do you go through your runners with, what's the right expectations coming into a race? Do you go through that type of coaching in your personal coaching?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and there's a couple different ways to do it. Like if it's someone who has been doing ultramarathons for a while and we have some precedent, we can look at kind of where their results were and kind of how the training went relative to that, and kind of come up with like an expectation. I like to have kind of like an aggressive, a moderate, and a conservative goal, and then say this is the zones that we operate within. At no point should you be going faster than this, and you should avoid going slower than this if it's not like something went wrong. So that is definitely one of the harder things to really whittle down accurately for the reasons we talked about before. But even if they haven't done a 100-miler before, a lot of times we can look at some of their kind of long run development phases where they might be doing like back-to-back long runs, or sometimes back-to-back-to-back long runs where they're doing 3 days that are just a fair bit higher volume than they would normally do. And we generate enough fatigue by that third run or that second run that you can take a pretty good look at things like what was their relative effort during that, what was the pace they produced, and then start kind of coming up with what would be a reasonable pacing strategy for the race itself. So there's ways to kind of do it as best we can and at least give them the confidence of knowing like this is an expectation that's not like so outside the realm of possibility or so unknown that I can put some faith in it and go out and just focus on executing versus worrying about whether they're doing it right or not.
So you work with runners in all levels. Is the fear of not finishing a thing? With
yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think that's one of the bigger fears to some degree, because I mean, one of the draws to ultramarathon, I think, is like, there's definitely different whys amongst the running community, and some people really get into just improving upon performance they've done in the past, where other people are a little more drawn to like, well, I've run 50 miles, I want to figure out what it's like to run 100 kilometers or 100 miles, and then now we have like 200 milers that are technically 200 plus that are getting more and more popular. There's events where it's like 6 days where you see how far you can run in 6 days. So there's all these opportunities to always push yourself from just like a duration or a time standpoint. That I think draw a lot of people to. And with that, I think definitely comes like, a bit of fear where, when you stand on that starting line and you begin running, if things go the way you want it to, you're going to run further than you have before in some of those situations. Yeah. So with that comes fear, anxiety, and just, everything that kind of you would expect with doing something you've never done before.
Having to block that out will be so important, I'm guessing, in the beginning.
Yeah, you definitely want to learn how to chunk the race. So just like any big project that you would do in life, like if you try to wrap your head around it all at once and then and comprehend what it's going to take. Yeah, you build in opportunities to experience small wins, recognize them, and focus on those versus the entirety of it. The way I like to say it, if you're thinking of mile 100 at mile 1, you're going to be in for a long day mentally for sure.
So let's say, has someone you coach actually didn't finish?
Didn't finish?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's just a reality of the sport. I mean, you have some races where they're just very difficult for whatever reason. Maybe there's an element that tends to make it more difficult to stick it out there. And you'll have like a 50% finisher rate. So it's like, you're just going to have some of that if you coach enough people, or, if you do enough of them. There are people who follow what they call death before DNF, which is before do not finish, or did not finish, I should say. And I think it's admirable to a degree, but it's also, I think, one of those things where if that's your thing, it is what it is. But I think most people, practically speaking, you do enough of these, it's just a matter of time before something goes wrong, where if you're honest with yourself, the better choice is to not finish the race versus, force yourself into the finish and, dig yourself in such a big hole where your next opportunity to do it again gets pushed back by a healthy margin. So I think there's a lot of individual characteristics and components to consider with that sort of thing. But yeah, I mean, there's, what makes ultramarathon running exciting is there is that chance that you're not going to make it to the finish line. And Just like, any sporting event or any competitive based thing, it's like there's a chance, even if the odds are in your favor, that you won't finish. So as a coach, the way I look at it and the way I try to describe to my clients is what we want to do is we want to minimize the chances of that happening to you as much as we can reasonably, but that chance is always there. So I think that's part of the deal, more or less.
Is there one biggest factor that beginners always take for granted in the beginning that they always miss?
I would say the biggest one is probably pacing. I think if I had to predict something, we're going to see the biggest improvement in finishing times in the sport of ultra running with improved pacing strategy. So when you just look at the kind of the pacing, there's like kind of three ways to think about it. There's like a negative split, meaning you ran faster in kind of the second half of the race than the first half of the race. There's an even split where you basically just run the exact even pace pretty much throughout the entire race. And then there's positive split where you're running slower at the end than you were in the beginning. And it is very difficult to find even splits. Almost all ultra runners are running positive splits. And I think you can run your best race with a positive split, but it's likely a very small margin versus what we're typically seeing. So a lot of times what that means then is people are just getting out too fast or too aggressively in those early stages, and that's costing them time at the end versus gaining them time at the end. And it's tough because you almost have to, I think, experience an even or negative split to really understand that you can actually feel much better at the end of a race than you do like in the middle of a race. Whereas most ultra runners' experience is going to be like you're going to have ebbs and flows where you feel really miserable and you feel much better. But generally speaking, people are going to report back that like the end of the race, the last like 10, 20 miles were the hardest part of that race. So it's really difficult, I think, from a psychological standpoint to hold back to the level at which you can even or negative split, even if that may be your best opportunity to run your fastest time. So I think that's probably the one that would be the most common amongst new or even experienced ultra runners for that matter. And sometimes it gets even more difficult too because you have yourself in a situation where you've set a standard for yourself. So like, naturally you're going to think like, okay, well, if I did that, if I'm doing this again, I may as well target a faster time. So you're always kind of trying to push that or find that very fine line that is going to produce an even split or close to an even split. And if you go a little bit past it, you might think that's the right strategy, or it might be the strategy, but then you find out, say at 60 miles, that turns out that wasn't accurate, and now you're going to pay for it because you went out too fast based on where your fitness is actually at.
So you pays for it at the end. So
yeah.
So why so beginners always miss that in the beginning? Is that a fear of being left behind or just competitiveness in the beginning? What do you think starts that for them?
Getting out too quick.
Yeah, getting out too quick.
I think there's two things going on there. One is you've tapered, you're pretty fit, so like the pace you go out feels much easier than it likely actually is. Then there is just the uniqueness that is a race setting. So if I send someone out for a long run when their legs are a little bit tired or fatigued perhaps from prior training, they're not 100% recovered the way they are at the starting line of a race when they've tapered for 2+ weeks. Then you add in the anxiety and the fear, these other things we've talked about that are going to just kind of induce kind of a little bit more of like an adrenaline state or like a cortisol dump or something like that, where you have them, you just end up kind of like acting versus thinking a lot of times. So it's really easy, I think, to get a little aggressive. And then there's also this draw where when your legs are feeling good, you're like, okay, well, if I'm feeling good, I might as well lean into it now, even though like that may be an indication that later on you're going to be feeling worse because of it. So the pay or the consequence for going out too hard is far enough down the road oftentimes that it's difficult to hold yourself back. So sometimes when I'm talking to people with 100 milers, I say go out at a pace that feels easy and then step back a little bit further even from that, and then you're probably closer to the right pace. So it's a very difficult thing to do, and when like people around you aren't necessarily following that strategy, it gets even more difficult because you feel like the race is running away from you versus you're in it. regardless of whether you're the front or the beginning. And there's also, like the back of the pack who are oftentimes fighting cutoffs too, where, they have to get to a specific aid station at a certain time or they're going to get pulled off the course. So there are times when that is just not even an option for them to go out slower. So, you have to be cognizant of all the variables for the person and their individual goals and things like that as well.
For beginners, what should the beginner start doing in the beginning that they're not doing right now that will help them perform better the next race?
Yeah, I think if we're talking about ultra runners specifically and ones that have kind of been in the sport for a bit, or you said beginners, so I guess technically I wouldn't be in the sport for a bit. I think like a lot of times when people decide they're going to do an ultra marathon, their first thought goes to, well, I got to be running a lot and I got to be doing these long runs all the time. So, and this is something I see even with experienced ultra runners sometimes, where it's like they start doing like these really long weekend long runs right at the beginning of the plan, and they kind of just keep them there like throughout the entirety of the plan. Where I don't necessarily think that's a great idea. First of all, it's not physiologically necessary, and it's also potentially mentally taxing for you to have to do that week in, week out for 16, 20, 24 weeks leading into a race. And if you find yourself doing too much of that, you could be standing at the starting line just not excited about the very thing you prepared yourself to try to do. And if you're gonna have to do 100 miles of it, you want to be excited about it enough to where you want to be out there, versus you're just like not think you might be thinking like, oh, this again, I've been kind of doing this over and over again all training. So I think a lot of times people they kind of mess up the order of operations of how they should be doing certain workouts. The reverse of that is I'll see people doing sometimes like short intervals like weeks before the race itself, where a short interval is so far from the intensity that they're going to be doing on race day. It's like very non-specific. I think they're important variables to training, so they're worth putting in your training plan, but you just want to put them in a place where they're going to be advantageous for you, but not detrimental in you being able to do the proper work that you'd be doing for the specific intensity you're trying to do on race day. So what that looks like is maybe a little less long runs early in the plan and a little more speed work, and then a little less speed work at the end of the plan, so you have extra training load to really be excited for and do the long runs when it matters most, so that you have enough of them so you are physiologically prepared for the race, but you're not mentally burnt out from it. And you're also not double dipping so much into intensity and duration that you're either getting injured, overreaching and fatiguing, and ending up showing up to the starting line kind of fried versus fresh. I think those are like a lot of times things that runners and ultra runners need to kind of like hear and learn a little bit before they really kind of find themselves doing the right things in training.
Man, I hope our listeners right now are taking notes, because I am ready to run right now. Man, there is a lot here that's are actionable, and you can probably use those right now. You can go back and listen to this, and there's a lot here. And talking to you about running, it doesn't seem intimidating anymore.
Well, that's good.
Yeah, and if you're listening right now, Zach offers a wide variety of coaching packages that range from personalized planning, pre-made plans, and training support. That's zachbitter.com, ZACHBITTER.com. That's right, Zach, right?
Yeah, perfect.
Awesome. Did we miss anything here, Zach?
No, I think we covered a lot of cool stuff. It was fun to chat and dive into all things ultramarathon running. Awesome,
man. I appreciate you coming on and sharing your story here with us. If you want to connect with Zach, it's zachbitter.com. It will be linked in the description box below, guys. Again, there's a lot here that you can actually use right now to start running, and make sure that take some notes. And any messages for new runners here, Zach?
Yeah, I think like when you're starting to run or you're new to running, you want to meet yourself where you're at. So I like to call it micro stretching, where you do just enough to elicit a response and then improve upon it, and you can do that over time. A lot of times I think runners, they get a little too either afraid of what they're about to do, so they try to get out a little too quick. or mimic someone else who's been training for a long time. So don't be afraid to start out slow and start out with like low volume and kind of work yourself into it so that your body actually adapts at a proper pace, and then it's sustainable for you for the long term.
Love it, Zach. Zach Bitter, guys. Thank you so much, Zach. I appreciate you.
Thanks a bunch. Take care.
All right.